Welcome to Module 2 that focuses on the financial planning process. My name is Catherine Solheim, and I will facilitate your learning as you listen to this presentation. This presentation will share some key concepts related to the financial planning process, evaluating current financial situations, securing basic needs through the creation of a budget or spending plan, and setting financial goals. Building wealth through savings and asset development will be covered in a later module. Depending on where families are in the life cycle, they have different needs. They have different available resources, and their tasks are different. Families with young children will have expenses related to school. They may have higher medical expenses, and they may be beginning to save for their children's college education. Families with teens will also have school expenses, but they may have increased expenses related to cars and insurance, and may be thinking more immediately about post-high school education. Teens may also be earning money through part-time jobs, so they can pay for some expenses themselves and even contribute to the household. As children leave the nest, families may begin to think more seriously about retirement and will increase their savings to adequately prepare for that transition. Of course, all of this depends on unique family circumstances. The number of wage earners in the household, the number of children, the health of all family members. It also depends on the values and attitudes that individuals and families have about money and finances. My own values were reflected in my previous inclusion of post-secondary education as a goal for children, but that might not be the case for everyone. And finally, financial planning and management is highly influenced by the economic conditions in which we live currently, but also how they have been in the past and how they will be in the future. Conditions such as employment and wages, the cost of housing, the cost of borrowing or interest rates, even the cost of gasoline for our cars will impact what resources we have to manage and the level of expenses we will incur. A first step to creating a financial plan is to analyze where you are right now. Several tools will help you accomplish this: a personal balance sheet or net worth calculation, an analysis of your cash flow or income and expenses, and an evaluation of your liquidity, debt to income, and savings ratios. I'll go over each of these in the following slides. Then you'll have an opportunity to practice using these tools. One of the most common financial ratios used to understand one's current financial situation is net worth, sometimes called a personal balance sheet. Many people actually fear doing this because they're afraid of what they might find. But it's important to remind ourselves and our clients that this is not measuring self-worth. We are so much more than our financial situation. But if we're serious about making some changes, knowing where we start is very important. This gives us a baseline from which to measure our progress. Think of it as doing research to know where you are, so you'll know how far you've come when you begin to see progress in your financial situation. The first step in calculating net worth is to list all of your assets. Use the fair market value of things you own. These would be things like your home, car, any jewelry you have, antiques, maybe you have musical instruments, your computers. You will find the fair market value on the World Wide Web. For example, you can use the Kelley Blue Book value of your car by looking up the make, model, mileage, and features on kbb.com. It's recommended that you be conservative in that estimation of value. Don't overestimate the value of your assets and be honest. Could you really get $500 for that 10-year-old sofa? In addition to property, you may also have investments such as stocks and bonds. The second step is to list all of your liabilities or debts. This might include any balances you have on credit cards, your mortgage, and other loan balances. You may also include any past or currently due bills. Now add up the value of your assets and add up the value of your debt. Now subtract your debt total from your asset total, and this gives you net worth. A second important thing to evaluate is where your money is going on a monthly and a yearly basis. Many of us have a pretty good idea of where bigger amounts of money are spent, especially what we spend on fixed expenses like our rent or a mortgage or a car payment. But we may not be aware of just how much we spend in the variable categories like eating out, entertainment, gas for our cars. And even harder to get a handle on is what we call spending leaks. Those little expenses that add up over time, like adding a magazine to our cart while waiting to check out at the grocery store, or buying that cup of coffee at the gas station. If we really want to know where our money goes, tracking spending for a month or two is highly recommended. Writing things down and keeping receipts will help you really see where you spend your money. Our Moodle site has a spending log to print and fill out. It's actually a good idea to engage the whole family in that tracking so everyone has a better understanding of where the household money goes. You should also gather other information that will help you create your cash flow statement. This might include pay stubs for income and payroll tax information, bills for monthly expenses such as utilities, cable, your internet bill, your phone bill, and don't forget the irregular expenses like property tax bills, or newspaper and magazine subscriptions, or the 6-month insurance payment. You will use the information you've gathered in Step 1 to complete the cash flow statement on the Moodle site. Remember to complete it for both a month and a year. The latter will capture those irregular expenses that tend to catch us off guard. Oh my, the car insurance bill is due next month? Be sure to check and double check because you want to include everything. Once you have everything written down, subtract your total expenses from your total income. This is your net cash flow. Then ask yourself some questions about that cash flow. Is your income greater than your expenses on a monthly basis? If yes, great, your cash flow is positive. Or are your expenses greater than your income on a monthly basis? If yes, your cash flow is negative and you are most likely taking on debt. Other questions to ask. Are you able to save something each month? Are you building a cash reserve or are you living paycheck to paycheck? Are you putting aside money for longer-term goals? What surprises you about your cash flow? Are you seeing any areas in which you could reduce spending? Or do you need to increase your income? There are several financial ratios that are also very helpful in evaluating one's current financial situation. The liquidity ratio estimates how many months one could pay monthly expenses with liquid assets, should you no longer have income or a stream of resources coming in. Liquid assets are cash or near cash assets. It's a relatively simple calculation done by dividing one's liquid asset amount by monthly expenses. So let's say you have a cash or near cash assets of about $2,000. You can get that information in your net worth statement. Your monthly expenses, including rent, utilities, food, etc., is $1,500. Divide 2,000 by 1,500, and the answer is 1.33. You would interpret that to mean that you could live approximately 1 1/3 months, or 1 month and 10 days on the liquid assets you have. This helps you evaluate whether or not you have adequate cash reserves. Of course, other things come into the picture, unemployment insurance or disability income, but it is a tool for analysis that can start good conversations and help you to think about cash reserve. The debt ratio evaluates the percentage of your total asset value that has been financed by debt. It is calculated by dividing your total debt by your total assets. Again, these data are in your net worth statement. So if you have a total debt of $100,000 and total assets of $200,000, your debt ratio is $100,000 divided by $200,000. The answer is 0.5, meaning that half or 50% of your assets are financed by debt. It's important to note that debt used to build assets, such as home mortgage, is different than debt used for regular consumption, such as credit card debt. The former adds to both sides of the equation. A home gives you both an asset and debt, while the latter, consumer credit card debt, adds only to the debt side and very little to the asset side. Debt payment or debt-to-income ratio is the percentage of after-tax income that is committed to paying required minimum monthly debt payments on consumer debt. Consumer debt does not include housing costs or mortgage debt. What is included is credit card debt, car loans, student loans, and personal loans. This ratio is often used by lenders who want to see if you're able to take on any more debt at your current income. However, it should be noted that when lenders use this, they often use the gross income in the denominator. And this can be problematic in that it will overestimate the amount of additional debt a person can easily take on. Lenders often require that this ratio does not exceed 33 to 38%, but that's gross income. Debt counselors, on the other hand, offer a little different advice. They often tell consumers who wonder about what is a safe amount of debt to have that at 10%, you're in control. At 15%, you're starting to be at the edge, and you need to be very careful. Try to pay down your debt to avoid getting into the overextended category. At 20% and greater, you're in the red, or actually the danger zone. This is where changes are really needed to get you back in balance. Finally, we have the savings ratio. This is the percentage of after-tax income that is available for saving for financial goals. By default, this is your positive net cash flow, or the amount of income over expenses. However, if your net cash flow is negative, you really are not saving and are increasing your debt. A common saying is, if you don't know where you're going, you'll probably end up someplace else. Well, that is especially true for finances. Goals have been found to make an important difference in whether or not people achieve their desired financial well-being. The acronym SMART has become a common way to think about setting goals. SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. These are all important components to include if your goals are to be effective. Think about this goal. I want to be rich one day. We probably all want to be rich, but what does that mean? What will you do to achieve it? How will you know when you get there? None of the SMART elements are there. It's not specific. We don't really know what we will do to achieve the goal of getting rich. It's not measurable. How will you know when you get to rich? It may not be realistic. I guess it depends on how you define rich. And it's not timely. In 5 years, 10 years, your lifetime? Let's take a little different approach. Let's think about goals in a bit smaller proportions. Goals that will direct behaviors to reach a valued end. First of all, I want you to take a minute to list 1, 2, 3 areas you want to work on related to your finances. I'll pause for a minute to let you write them down. Now take one of them and state that goal as a declaration of intention. For example, I will save to build an emergency cash reserve fund. Again, I'll pause so you can write something down that will have a declaration of intention using an action verb. Okay, you're on your way. Now, attach the specifics: an amount to save, an endpoint, and a date you want to reach your goal. So it might look something like this. I will save $50 from each biweekly paycheck for 2 years until I reach $2,000 for my cash reserve. Finally, review your goal to see if it meets the realistic and achievable components. If not, go back and adjust your goal to meet those 2 criteria. Using what you've learned in your cash flow analysis, you'll want to create a spending plan that will meet your basic needs, reduce debt, and build in savings. The Moodle site contains an interactive worksheet to create a spending plan or budget. First, you want to plan for your fixed expenses. These might be things like rent or your insurance payments. Then you want to plan for variable expenses. These are expenses that vary from month to month, like what you spend on clothing. What you spend on food is can be quite variable, even what you spend for gas for your car. Then you want to add expenses together and compare to after-tax income. Finally, you want to evaluate that bottom line and see, do your expenses exceed your income? If yes, what areas can be trimmed? Most likely those will be in the variable expense categories. You might also ask, have you planned for savings and debt reduction? Are they built into your plan? Many people ask if there are recommendations for amounts that should be spent in various categories. And really the answer is that there's no one-size-fits-all. Remember, we talked about factors that influence your situation, like life cycle stage, values, economic conditions. But it is helpful to have some general sense of proportions. So that's why the 50-30-20 budget has been recommended by several financial counselors and provides a good rule of thumb when building a budget. Starting with your after-tax income, aim to limit your needs or must-have expenses to 50% of that amount. This would include housing, utilities, transportation, food, insurance, and other expenses like childcare. If it's an expense that can be delayed, such as clothing or entertainment, then it's not really a must-have. The second category is your wants, which should comprise about 30% of after-tax income. These might be expenses for gifts, entertainment, clothing, vacations. Internet may be a want, unless your child requires it for school or you need it for work. Cable is a want for most people, even though sometimes we put it in the need category. Finally, the savings and debt repayment category should be 20% of your budget. It can be a little tricky to balance between the two. The urge is to pay down debt before building savings. But that leaves us vulnerable to take on additional debt unless there is some cushion. Building an emergency cash reserve is an important goal, as is debt reduction and saving for longer-term goals such as retirement. We'll discuss that in greater length next. So check your spending plan after you've created it. Does it meet the 50-30-20 recommendation? What can you do to trim the must-haves? Are there wants that have been taking scarce resources away from savings and longer-term goals? This is where adjustment occurs. Many Americans live paycheck to paycheck, having no cash reserve, which is sometimes also called an emergency fund. This is a safety net that's used when an unexpected expense pops up or something more serious arises. There is little consensus in the field about how much is enough. Recommendations range from the amount needed to cover 6 to 9 months of expenses if one is employed in a relatively stable job, but it could be up to 1 year or longer if you're self-employed or your employment sector is quite unstable. The recent economic downturn and the increased risk for unemployment in all sectors has resulted in higher cash reserve recommendations. It is difficult for people to keep their cash reserve money in accounts that yield low interest, which are the ones that are liquid. Even certificates of deposit no longer provide yields that keep up with inflation. But financial planners believe that access to cash reserves is important to maintain financial stability when the unforeseen expenses or situation arises. If a person is working to reduce debt, building a cash reserve can seem counterintuitive. Why not put all available extra cash into debt reduction? The challenge with that approach is that when an unexpected need for cash arises and none is available, The only option is to use credit, which adds to the debt one is trying to reduce. So once a positive net cash flow is achieved through the budgeting process, one of the first financial goals that individuals should pursue is building their cash reserve. Whew, that was a lot to cover, but it's important to do these analyses. It is important to set goals, and it's important to create a plan to provide a solid foundation that allows you to gain control over where your finances go, and that they are going toward important short, intermediate, and long-term goals, eventually building wealth over your lifetime. These analyses can be done on an annual basis to evaluate your progress and to make adjustments as needed. One of the best ways to learn and understand these tools is to apply them to your own situation. We have a series of worksheets included on the Moodle site that we'd like you to complete using your own financial information. This is not meant to be shared with anyone, but rather to provide you with a chance to apply what you've learned. But then we will ask you to do the same thing for our case study couple, Felipe and Cheryl. Once the second set of worksheets is completed, you'll be asked to submit them so we can evaluate whether or not you understand these important concepts and calculations. I wish you luck in analyzing your situation and applying them to Cheryl and Felipe's case study.